Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Photographic Gallery. Thank you for joining us for the fourth and last webinar of the series, Decolonize the Lens. Over the course of this series, we've invited photographic experts and scholars to look at the local history of photography in Egypt and Northeast Africa to consider ways to decolonize the lens, the imperial gaze. In each of the previous webinars, our guest speakers have presented different approaches to rethinking the dominant narratives in the history of photography. Decolonize the Lens is a joint research project between faculty in journalism and mass communication, the history department, and the Photographic Gallery. The previous webinars are now available on the gallery's YouTube channel, which I will post a link to, and which I've sent in the email that you've received before the webinar. And before we start today's presentation and discussion, I will briefly introduce the Photographic Gallery, my collaborators, Dr. Ronnie Close and Dr. Mark Dietz, and today's guest speaker, Dr. Michelle Moyd. The Photographic Gallery was founded in 1991 as part of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, GAP. And it is located in the New Cairo campus of the university and offers a public program of exhibitions, educational projects, workshops, and talks around the academic year. The gallery showcases photography works by young, emerging, and established local and international photographers and students. My collaborators, Ronnie Close is an associate professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at the American University in Cairo. His research interests look at the relationship between aesthetics and politics, and he has worked on a long-term project on the ultras football movement in Egypt, Brazil, and Palestine. Through visual research projects, workshops, and written publications, he looks at the role of the image object in the contemporary world. Mark W. Dietz is assistant professor of African and world history at the AUC. He is a social and cultural historian of modern Africa, with a research focus on the Senegambian region of West Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. His research emerges from his diplomatic experience in Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, and Cape Verde. And his current book project, based on his 2017 dissertation at Cornell University, is a socio-cultural history of the Casamance conflict in southern Senegal, tentatively entitled A Country of Defiance, Mapping the Casamance in Senegal. Mark's work has been published in History in Africa, the Journal of Asian and African Studies, the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of American History, and the blog site Africa is a Country. Today's guest speaker, Michelle Moyd, is the Ruth N. Hall's Associate Professor in the Department of History and Associate Director of the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society at Indiana University, Bloomington. She's the author of Violent Intermediaries, African Soldiers, Conquest, and Everyday Colonialism in German East Africa, 2014, which explores the social and cultural history of African soldiers, the askari, in the colonial army of German East Africa, today's Tanzania. She's currently at work on a short book entitled Africa, Africans and the First World War, which will examine the spectrum of African experience in the war, especially as a soldier and worker. Before we start, I'd like to thank the American University in Cairo for funding this program. And as with the previous webinars, we are using the webinar format. So you will only be seeing the co-hosts on the screen, and we will not use the raise hand feature. You can make your comments and ask questions via the chat box throughout Michelle's talk, which is approximately 30 minutes long. And Ronnie and I will collect your questions for Mark to pose to Michelle after the talk. Then Michelle can address the most popular questions since time will be limited. So let's get started. Mark, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dina. It's such a pleasure to be able to welcome Michelle to today's webinar. Michelle and I go back a ways. And in fact, before I even started my grad school journey at Cornell, I contacted Michelle, I think it was in 2009, Michelle, because she had just finished her PhD in African history at Cornell, and I was interested in doing the same thing. And Michelle and I also shared the kind of a common history of being military veterans. Michelle in the Air Force and myself in the Marine Corps. And so she answered all my questions very kindly, and she's really been a source of inspiration and guidance for me. And I just really appreciate her and her friendship, and in many ways her mentorship. So I remain grateful for her kind assistance and wise counsel through the years. You know, the other thing about Michelle's presence here today is that in some ways, this entire webinar series was inspired by Michelle and by an article that she published in the American Historical Review last year, in which she wrote a reflection about stepping down from the associate editor position of the journal, and about decolonizing the academy. And that kind of became the spark for this entire webinar series, because I like reposted Michelle's article. I think it was on Twitter, and Ronnie saw that, and then kind of came up with the idea for this series. So we actually owe a great deal of our inspiration for this entire series to Michelle. So today, we're going to be expanding the geographical coverage of the series from Egypt to Northeast and East Africa. And so the question is, what can we learn from doing that? Perhaps comparative colonialisms, can we learn things from kind of similarities and differences between some of the colonial systems that we've talked about? And are there differences when it comes to decolonizing the lens? Are there differences between those colonial systems? But I think most of us would agree that to decolonize the lens, we need to move to the other side of the camera, to see colonialism through the eyes of the colonized and less through the eyes of the colonizer. Michelle's historical analysis of the Ascaris soldiers fighting and policing for the German Empire helps us do just that. In a way, looking at these portrayals, as I've been looking over Michelle's work again this week, looking at these portrayals of these African colonial servicemen is one of the most intimate portraits, I think, that we can find of the relationships between citizens and subjects in the age of new imperialism in the late 19th century. Michelle wonderfully ties these intimate portraits to the important social and cultural change at the time and into the early 20th century. So, Michelle, we look forward to your guiding us through that examination. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark and Dina, for the lovely introduction. And thanks to Ronnie Close as well for, along with Mark and Dina, inviting me to do this today. I'm really excited to be able to have an opportunity to talk a bit and think out loud some about photography, because that's something that's been not new, but an area that I've been trying to kind of pay more attention to in my work. And so let me start, and I'm going to try and keep this to no more than 25 minutes because I'm really interested in the discussion. So I'm going to start my timer and share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see that first slide. Thumbs up. Okay, great. So the title of my talk is Visual Testimonies, Photography, Sudanese Soldiers, and Origin Stories in German East Africa's Colonial Army. that's a lot, but hopefully what you'll see is that each section is fairly short and compact and is really only dealing with a small set of photos that I've been thinking about for a really long time now. So I'm starting with this portrait on this first slide of a Schutztruppe askari whose name seems to have been Maleti. And you can see in this image, he's wearing kind of the standard khaki uniform. You can see his rank on his sleeve. You can see one decoration, and you can see his unit designation on his headgear, which is tarbush, kind of a combination modeled after a fez, but it also has this kind of piece of cloth that hangs over the back of the neck. So this portrait of an askari is distinct in that the soldier's name is known and in its formal composition, which provides viewers with a closer view of an individual askari than is typical. Usually they're depicted in kind of groups or in motion, but this kind of full frontal facial view is not that typical. So while there are many images of askari out there, this one is quite striking. For one thing, the insignia, rank, and unit designation on the uniform is all clearly visible, as I said. If I actually had a roster, I would know more about him in terms of his age and perhaps his service record and that sort of thing, but those kinds of documents are quite difficult to come by. For reasons I can talk about in Q&A if people are interested. In addition, the directness of the soldier's return gaze and his stoic expression contribute to the photograph's power as a kind of visual testimony about African soldiers who fought in the colonial army, or Schutztruppe, in German East Africa, which is today's Tanzania, between 1890 and 1918. 1890 is a significant, is kind of a formative date for the Wissmann-Truppe, which is actually kind of the predecessor or precursor to the Schutztruppe, which was formalized in 1891 as an imperial army. And then 1918 is when Germany loses its colonies at the end of World War I. So I start with this photograph, and I'll return to it at the end. Although the photograph would seem to be quite straightforward as a representation of an askari, I think it also raises some interesting questions about what we see when we look at soldiers' portraits. So I'll come back to that. What I'm going to do is start with a brief overview of the Schutztruppe's composition and talk a bit about how it relates to this series. Namely through the so-called Sudanese or newbie soldiers the Germans recruited in Cairo in 1899, 1889, which was a foundational moment for the Schutztruppe, which again, as I mentioned earlier, was actually the Wissmann-Truppe, named after its founder, Hermann von Wissmann, in that first couple of years. It became the Schutztruppe in 1891. Second, I'll show you some photographs that illustrate how Sudanese soldiers became kind of model askari, even as they retained a distinct place in the Schutztruppe's martial race paradigm or martial race imaginaries. Finally, I return to the image, this image here that I'm starting with, and offer a deeper, though also speculative reading based on how Sudanese and newbie soldiers became visible across different colonial armies operating in the region. So just for some background, probably people who are on here know these things, but just in case. Although this army fought in what is today Tanzania, so where's my cursor? Here's German East Africa. Although they fought in what is today Tanzania, its recruits came from different locations across northeastern, eastern, and southeastern Africa. There were actually troops who were drawn from what is today Mozambique as well. the Sudanese soldiers, so-called Sudanese soldiers who were recruited to the Schutztruppe were ex-soldiers of the Anglo-Egyptian army who had fought against the Mahdi in the 1880s and were then released after their defeat, after the defeat at Khartoum. And they were living in poverty in Cairo, considered a nuisance by the authorities in Cairo, soldiers without anything to do. And so they were recruited by the Germans to help protect company interests, the German East Africa Company's interests, as they, and to begin to gain a foothold in the territory that had essentially been kind of held out for them as a result of the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885. I can say more about what's now referred to as the Coastal Rebellion too, if people are interested. But essentially, this small army was assembled quickly in order to defeat this threat to German company interests, and was also used as the moment to kind of institute or instantiate effective occupation in Germany, East Africa. So about 600 of these Sudanese, so-called Sudanese men were transported by ship from Egypt to German East Africa in 1899. And then smaller contingents of troops came from elsewhere, as I pointed out earlier. These were therefore much older and more experienced soldiers who already had significant amount of training in European imperial styles of warfare. Their seniority and experience vaulted them to the top of the Schutztruppe officers' ranking of martiality, which was a racialized kind of hierarchy, and I can say more about that too. Although in the first few years of the Schutztruppe's formation, its units were segregated by the troops' origin groups. So there was a Sudanese unit, or Sudanese units, there were Zulu units, and there were so-called Swahili units being the ones who were recruited from in and around German East Africa, or company retainers. Over time, the senior Sudanese askari increasingly took on leadership roles across all of the units, again, because of their seniority and experience. Okay, so the map on the right is just a campaign map that I have here for the East Africa campaign of World War I, which we can refer to if necessary later in the talk. Okay, so part two, I'm going to talk now about a few photographs. By the late 1890s, the British stopped allowing German recruitment of Sudanese troops because of the British reconquest, again in quotation marks, that finally resulted in the defeat of the Mahdist state in 1899. The Sudanese troops who remained were therefore highly valued by their German employers. So this image, this first image that I'm showing you here is the caption reads Sultan Muhammad Ahmed with his wives. There are a lot of things that you can kind of pull from this photograph. It's also in my book, so I've been, kind of looking at it and thinking about it for a long time. But the basics are that, he's standing very tall and erect. He is, he's surrounded by women who we presume to be part of his household, his kin. And he has the highest rank possible for a askari, and he is bedecked with medals. And what's interesting about the caption is that it names him not as a senior askari, but as a sultan. And sultan suggests that he actually has taken on some kind of leadership role within the local colonial administration following his retirement from the Schutztruppe. That's how I read this photograph. And so he is a senior veteran Ascari who has transitioned into local leadership, is at least in terms of how the photographer has captioned the photo, is using this, is being seen as somebody with this title of Sultan, which of course is problematic and strange, but for the purposes of interpreting the photo, it's important. The other thing I'll say is that, you know, the backdrop to the photo is a tent, and you can also see a thatched building on to the side there, kind of suggesting a combination of the domestic and the military in what matters to him and the way that the photograph is composed. And then of course, the number of women who surround him, which is a marker of his status as a big man in the local context. So that's one example of a photo that I use quite frequently to try and draw out some of the themes that are important for understanding who the Schutztruppe Ascari, Sudanese Ascari were. This one I've worked with a lot less, but I also think is really, could be really fruitful for further analysis. So this is an image that depicts a group of some of the first recruits from Sudanese recruits from Cairo in sorry, I'm having trouble with numbers today, 1889. In the foreground, you can see Hermann von Wissmann, the founder of the Wissmann-Truppe, along with a few of his comrades who are helping him with this recruitment drive. But what's interesting about the photo for what I'm talking about today is the differences you can see in the uniform wear for these men, in particular the headgear, the turban, as opposed to what will later become a fez and tarbush in German East Africa. The khaki, kind of similar, the belt around the waist, kind of similar, the leg wraps, etc. All of that looks very familiar. But the turbans are definitely different. And also on the far right, you can see this man who is holding a sword. And that indicates that he is an effendi, someone who had the rank of, had an officer's rank. He could never command white troops, but he could be senior, the most senior in the colonial context, commanding African men. And the Germans did have that effendi position for a short time through most of the 1890s. You can see them kind of popping up, but they eventually did away with that status as recruitment of additional Sudanese troops became difficult. Okay, so now back to Maleti, part 3. So Maleti's image seems to have been done in 1960. This photograph seems to have been taken in 1916. So we're skipping forward from that last one I showed you. And the obvious things to note about the photograph and about Maleti are its clear references to his military service and position, as I talked about earlier. These captions that come from 2 separate repositories of images emphasize his status as an exemplary soldier in the midst of the East African campaign of World War I. So again, he's looking directly at the camera, his face betraying nothing but good soldierly comportment. Oh, and these two captions both point out his medal there that he received for general excellence as a soldier. This image, one of those kind of free-floating images that you see here and there with little contextualization. I think of it as one of the kind of more illustrative, one of the images that is often used to illustrate who the Ascari were, often without much commentary. So this image comes from a page in Ludwig Deppe's memoir Deppe was a military doctor who accompanied units on campaign during World War I in East Africa. And he published this massive memoir just after the war ended. So it's really quite incredible, clearly drafted from notes he had taken while on the march, and assembled with just a huge collection of photos of from various contexts. And sure enough, there is Maleti. And the caption there says, a brave hero, Ascari Sergeant Maleti underneath. So so Deppe cuts out the description of the medal and that sort of thing, but you can still see that he's being used here to kind of, so this is a chapter that discusses the Schutztruppe more generally, and Malete is kind of standing in as the representative of the Ascari as excellent soldiers. So now I want to try to do a little bit of a deeper reading and offer some perspectives that I hope will be useful in thinking about decolonizing the lens, decolonizing photography. So again, you can see that he was from his tarbush, the number on his tarbush, that he was part of the 4th Company, 4th Field Company during the East African campaign. And if you look up what the 4th Company was doing in the first 2 years of the war, you can see that they were active in some of the key German victories in the early phase of the war at Tanga, in the Kilimanjaro region, and also in blowing up British railways. After 1916, late 1916 and into 1917, things began to take a turn for the worse for the Germans. But in 1916, there was still likely quite a bit of cause for hope on the part of the Schutztruppe Ascari. So that's one way we can think about this image. If we look closely, there's another thing though, and this is what I'm going to spend most of the rest of my time on, hopefully no more than 5 minutes. If you look closely at this image, you'll see on Maleti's cheek there, 3 kind of diagonal scars. And in this, I think that we can make an argument that Maleti is participating in kind of a complex economy of violence that ties him to a legacy of Sudanese military service across this vast geographic swath that I've talked about. So there's good reason to think that these scars tie him to a complex of newbie soldiers who were referred to, at least in the 1970s, as the 111s. And that is which refers to this kind of vertical, or in this case, diagonal scarification on the faces, which indicated that these men had ties to the old kind of slave soldiering complex that came out of out of Sudan's relationship with Egypt over the course of the 19th century. This is a very complex history. I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. But what's interesting about sorry, I'm trying to turn my timer off. About this showing up in Maleti, of course, is that there were very few, if any, Sudanese troops left in the Schutztruppe by this time in 1916. So what's going on here? The scars could be an attempt to mimic those of the old Sudanese askari who were at the pinnacle of the Schutztruppe martial race hierarchy, but whose actual physical presence had waned since the late 1890s in kind of an elective strategy of choosing the askari almost as a kind of ethnicity, a new identity that stood on its own. The scars might indicate that he somehow made it into the Schutztruppe from another context, like Uganda, where men with similar scars were referred to as the 111s, as I said earlier. In an earlier iteration, these markings could have indicated a soldier's slave origins in southern Sudan, but later they probably more likely indicated either a connection to soldiers who were attached to Emin Pasha in the Lado enclave, which I've circled here, kind of that area where Sudan, Congo, and Uganda touch each other. So in that blue circle. And these histories, interestingly, point the way to Idi Amin, whose ethnic ties to so-called newbies in northern Uganda were well known. I can say more about that later too. So, you know, Moleti is not a typical Sudanese name. In fact, I think it's probably Kiswahili, and in Kiswahili, it means mullet, like the fish mullet, I'm guessing, but although I'm not clear on why. And if this photo was taken in 1916, he's definitely not a Sudanese soldier. Okay, so just to kind of try to wrap things up here, as I was trying to do the research around this photo and figure out where it came from and who took it and all of that, I learned, this was not the case when I was doing my dissertation or my book, but these images, this and other images that are frequently used in the study of colonial militaries in East Africa seem to now be kind of marketed through the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which seems to have bought an archive of these photos from August Scherl Verlag, a publisher of many of these kinds of books like Deppa's. So that explains how the image got into Deppa's book. And then also Alami, which sells all sorts of stock photography, is also selling this in conjunction with the Süddeutsche Zeitung. So, so I just wanted to highlight that as a kind of key piece of how these images become detached from their context. Okay, so I'll move to just concluding now. And what I'm trying to do in the conclusion is to think about what Moleti himself was aspiring to. I'm thinking here with Tina Kamp's work on listening to images, which I can explain more if people want to know. I would argue that he was probably like other askari who was in search of a respectable life, including a large household, perhaps some livestock or a plot of land, higher rank, higher pay, the ability to wield authority in a colonized society. But in 1916, when this image was taken, if we trust the captioning, that set of aspirations was under threat. The Schutztruppe's early successes in the East African campaign of World War I by late 1916 were becoming more and more remote. And the new reality of potential defeat at the hands of British, Belgian, South African colonial armies arrayed against them was becoming more and more real. So I don't know what became of Moleti, but his facial markings tell us a story with or without the uniform. So what can it even mean to decolonize images of Black colonial soldiers? Analysis can help to undo the myths and stereotypes around them and can help locate them in wider histories and socioeconomic processes of unfreedom in the making and unmaking of empires. Analysis can also offer suggestions for how to read, hear, or feel photos. I can bring my whole range of research skills and accumulated knowledge to bear in interpreting these photographs with the hope of using them more effectively as evidence in narrating histories of peoples who did not leave much of a written record. But to what end? Beyond the exercise of understanding Maleti within successive contexts of imperial violence across different parts of the continent, what does it mean to decolonize this lens? In some ways, I think Maleti's photograph refuses decolonization. He was part of the colonial apparatus. This is the hard part. Maleti's photograph is compelling because he appears to have been an excellent soldier in the cause of German colonialism. And this probably means that he had begun to secure for himself a respectable life, differentiating himself from the many Tanzanian peoples who experienced impoverishment, violence, and theft of land because of Schutztruppe actions before and during the First World War. Is naming this violence a part of decolonization? I'm not sure. At the same time, perhaps his scars give me another way in. They convey identification with the military organization that gave him the means to aspire to a relatively prosperous future, but they also harken back to regional histories of violence that had produced men like him over successive generations. And here, the decolonial critique is clearer. The theft of people to make imperial armies, the theft of land to make empires, the theft of lives to produce acquiescence and fear. Maleti was a decorated askari in the context of World War I, and his image has circulated as a quintessential example of a loyal askari. But his scars lead me back to different histories of violence against colonized peoples. It's in that space that I linger, resisting the easy reading, forming a decolonial critique that points to a politics of survival, as well as the need for restitution and repair. And the last thing I'll say is that in naming this commodification of images, especially through Alami, which you can look at their prices there on the right, and their detachment from the context I've outlined here, I want to point to the ways that we in academia participate in these economies. I was fortunate to find that my library had access to the Cheryl Alami photos through a kind of educational conglomerate that has digitized or sort of brought these archives into library collections. I have the library's copy of Depa's memoir sitting on my office desk, even though it's over 100 years old. What should decolonial practice in analyzing these images be? That's a question that I'm left with. So these are the questions that have been on my mind of late as I linger with and study this image that I've used as an illustration for so long. It is iconic, but it has more to say than that. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Michelle. Certainly given us a lot to think about. I wondered if just to kind of get the conversation started with Q&A, I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about this term that you use a lot in your book, where you talk about everyday colonialism, and like why you think that that is so important to talk about with the history of the Ascari. And so maybe you could explain to us like what you mean by that term and why you think it is valuable for us to think about as we look for ways to decolonize the lens.
Yeah, thanks. So to me, everyday colonialism is kind of the central key way of thinking about what the Ascari were doing in their work lives. So I think one of the ways that colonial violence is often rendered is that, that it is agentless, that it kind of, there's the colonizer, there's the colonized, and they fight, and there's bloodshed, and it's horrible. I was really interested in trying to show all of the ways that soldiers, colonial soldiers did so much more than that, and that too was part of the making of colonialism in East Africa and elsewhere. So their roles, not just as soldiers and police, you could think of them as constabularies, would actually combine the two. But they participated in tax collection and vaccination campaigns, and they delivered messages, and they escorted people, and they guarded people who were doing forced labor. They did a range of things that made it possible for the colonial state to exist. And so that texture of their everyday lives is what I was interested in getting at. And I think that, the kind of classic juxtaposition of the big events in history versus the everyday is the one that historians often grapple with, because if you focus too closely on the minutia of everyday stuff, this askari went here and delivered this message or collected taxes from this village, etc. You may lose the fact that there was a war named Maji Maji going on or something like that. But I think that actually in trying to understand how colonialism works, it's really imperative to think about those, that intermediary class of folks who are kind of who are what make it work over the long term, on a day-by-day basis, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question from audience member Maurice. And Maurice wants to know, did the Ascaris answer directly to the East German company, or were they considered subordinates of an official German army? He says, I'm thinking of the sepoys of the East India Company, who were a private army of the East Indian Company, and who at their height were like 250,000 strong, the world's largest private army ever. So yeah, how's that sound?
Yeah, thanks, Maurice. So there were askari who were part of the company's kind of retinue that were sort of loaned to them by the leadership on Zanzibar, the Omani leadership on Zanzibar. And so when the coastal rebellion started, those men were already kind of in place as a bulwark against the coastal leaders' armed retinues, but they were not enough. And so that's what caused Visman to go looking elsewhere after, it kind of became a priority for Bismarck to make this happen. But once the Vismantruppe was built, they answered, those soldiers who went over to the Vismantruppe answered to Visman and his commanders. And then in 1891, the Schutztruppe became an imperial protectorate force. And so at that point, and for the rest of their existence, the Schutztruppe was the overall command for soldiers who drew salaries from them. That said, there were also many, many auxiliaries who were drawn from allies to the Germans over the course of 1890 to 1918. And it's very hard to study those folks because they're just not documented very well.
Okay. Michelle, we have a question from audience member Salma. She says, I'm interested to know a little more about the slave complex that you mentioned relating to Egypt and Sudan. And would this include women or just a military relationship?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the slave complex, I guess in a nutshell, the way to describe the dynamic that I'm referring to as kind of a touchstone for understanding how this kind of Sudanese or newbie military identity gets built is I would say out of two central dynamics between Egypt and Sudan in the 19th century. The first is raiding for slaves that was coming from, was sort of initiated in part by the need for the Egyptian army to have new recruits, but also came from a pretty active commercial slave trading endeavor that was run by, kind of local or regional potentates, men who were at the nexus of politics and commercial economics. And which also came out of a longer complex in Sudan of raiding back and forth between Northerners and Southerners, right? I mean, this history is immensely complex, and I'm not going to do it justice here, but I think it's there's a tangle of different kind of processes of violence that all in the end lead to young men, especially being pressed into military service, first as so-called gun boys, and then kind of once they've been cut off from their kinship networks, and the military becomes their kin, their family, they progress through the ranks and they become senior soldiers. They also become babas or fathers to future gun boys, right? And it becomes a self-perpetuating system. So that's the slave soldier dynamic. Women are definitely part of it. I think the captivity piece is a little bit different in as much as my sense is that it's the armies themselves, either the kind of small armies that are being built by these slave trading men or the Egyptian army. They are constantly engaged in raiding of local communities, which includes the capture of women and children and the theft of goods. And there are some pretty good kind of life histories of a couple of Sudanese soldiers who narrate this very clearly, that they were taken as boys, they became part of the system, and then they participated in all of these abuses against peoples in northeastern Africa during the second half of the 19th century. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that answers both those questions. Thank you. We have a question from Justin Carville. He says the regimental photographic album became an increasing feature of military culture during the First World War and frequently disclosed the class, caste, and racial hierarchies of colonial regiments. Could you please speak more about the archival form of the photographs of Ascaris soldiers from this period? Are there examples of Sudanese soldiers in regimental albums? And if so, how might this open up avenues for decolonial histories to emerge through not only the analysis of individual photographs, but also their patterns or arrangement and circulation within colonial military culture? That's a mouthful.
Yeah. Gosh. Thank you so much for that. It's really thoughtful. So I guess in thinking about the archival form of how we access photos of the Ascari and within that so-called Sudanese soldiers, we're really relying on two main collections, I would say. The first is the German federal government's colonial photo collection, which covers many things, but definitely has one of the most important collections of photography by a military, by a Schutztruppe officer, photographer. I think he was in the Schutztruppe, he might not have been. Anyway, his name was Walter Dobertin, and he took many, many pictures, especially during World War I, of soldiers in action, both kind of staged photos, and then also ones where there's more dynamism and in action kinds of photos. The other major collection is the one that's at the University of Frankfurt, and it holds the German Colonial Society's collection of, I don't know, it's something like 40,000 photos. And in there, for example, the photo of the Sudanese troops before they leave Egypt comes from that collection. And so there are many different nodes, I guess, there are many different inputs of how photos end up in that collection, but those are the first two places I would look. But, you know, having said that, there are tons of other repositories that are underused. So the now defunct German Ethnological Museum has an amazing collection of photo albums by one Schutztruppe officer named, appropriately, vom Krieg. These are super interesting images that have hardly been used. And then all these images that are inside of memoirs like Deppe's, which many of them also have not been used, and the resolution is not great, obviously. But for somebody who is interested in doing kind of more archival or recovery work around these photographs, there's a lot to be done. There are you're describing regimental photo albums is not something I've seen for the Schutztruppe, at least not in East Africa. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but I just haven't really seen anything like that. So yeah, those are kind of the main sources.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. We'll see how much we might be out of time after this question, but we have another good question from audience member Paul Steege. He wants to pick up on your reference to Maleti as a decorated askari. Can you say a bit more about his doubled decoration? In other words, the scarring and the bemetalling? So to what extent do they connect to various forms of violence, to his body or to other bodies? Do you have any sense about who might have made those various decorations?
Ooh, that is a great question, Paul. Thank you. I would say I'm in the very early stages of thinking about kind of the scars as embodied history of violence, right? And I started to kind of get there as I was finishing up preparing this talk, but there's very little reference in the materials that I've seen to the actual act of marking men, particularly once it's not about older Sudanese men who were probably marked as children or as young men, right? But these men who were perhaps mimicking this older mode of marking the body in order to indicate belonging to askari, not belonging to a particular identity, an ethnic identity per se, but marking themselves as askari, as the dominant identity. There's very little. So what I'm doing is kind of extrapolating back to this case of the Lado Enclave, the soldiers who were with Emin Pasha, and then whose descendants seem to have been the community that produced Idi Amin and who were his kind of support, his military support for his years in power. So I'm kind of pulling a lot of things together in order to make a suggestive argument. I had not thought about connecting the two kinds of decoration, and I really like that idea a lot. In particular, because the depiction of soldiers with their military awards pinned to their chests is such a powerful marker of, or container for all of the ways that we think about what soldiers are or are not, right? If the soldier doesn't have a decoration on their chest, they're just a soldier, right? But once they're decorated, then that means they've done something special. They've stood out. And so, so I like the idea of thinking about the connection between the embodied experience of violence and how it's read through decorations on the battlefield. Because I mean, the really hard part, and what I tried to say in that last section of my paper, is that we can contextualize Maleti within the East African campaign as one of the loyal askari who were so important to German post-war memory and the desire to kind of use the askari as a way to reclaim their status as a colonizer after having been stripped of their colonies. But we also have to know that Maleti probably before the war was part of the complex of violence that dispossessed the peoples of Tanzania over a long time span. And it's how do you capture the decoration for valor or for marksmanship or for excellent service while also naming the colonial violence that caused people great harm.
Right, yeah, that intermediary role that you focus on. Okay, final question, Michelle. This is from Montiana Bashur. She says, how significant is affect and the politics of emotion in navigating images of Ascari culture? For example, where Baba relationships were in effect while moving up the ranks, were these strictly in form of military guidance or more like overall mentorship?
Gosh,
Is there
that's a
room
great
for feelings in military culture?
I believe so, yes. Especially the materials that I like to work with the most, which are memoirs, because in some ways they provide these really unvarnished glimpses of the interior of these military cultures that other historians are not necessarily so enthusiastic about, but I have long been drawn to them precisely for this reason. So I think, the figure of Baba and this kind of paternal, the paternalism of the Ascari and the goal sort of being the goal of upward mobility, which then allows men to achieve their full adulthood and then also to become patrons of others. That piece feels, it feels very kind of materially oriented, and it feels in many instances quite violent because the gun boys, the women who lived in Ascari households were under extreme pressure to do domestic labor, whether in garrison or on the march. At the same time, of course, you do get glimpses of affection, not so much with the boys, but with women. There is obviously that component of affective life is there. Where you see kind of an emotional component, I think, is in places where German officers observe their soldiers reflecting on their fate. So for example, there's a lot of reference to a kind of, and again, this is racist and Islamophobic, but there's a lot of reference to a kind of inbuilt Muslim stoicism and fatalism about what's happening to them, which the German officers find really compelling and comforting. But what I see is, you know, men who are career soldiers thinking about what it's like to be facing battle over and over again, or who knows, certain kinds of trauma. We don't have access to those kinds of interior lives, or at least not very much of them. But I absolutely do think that these internal kind of unit dynamics that you can see a little bit of, especially in the memoirs, gives us a way into kind of thinking about how these men are moving between these different contexts as family men, as householders, but also as professional soldiers who are involved in horrific colonial violence, and everything in between, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've got so many more excellent questions coming in from the audience. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us. I think this is a wonderful presentation with which to wrap up the series. Yeah, your work is just so fascinating, so professional. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And to kind of wrap things up for the webinar series overall, I'd like to turn it over to Ronnie Close, who basically did all the work of applying for this grant and helping us to organize this and inviting me and Dina to join him. So over to you, Ronnie, for the conclusion.
Okay, well, thanks, Mark. I haven't prepared anything, so thanks a lot for that. Well, I'd like to just thank Michelle for a really fantastic research, and it's incredibly interesting. And there were so many really great points actually raised by the audience out there today as well. And sadly, we didn't get to use everyone's questions. But I just wanted to say that anyone who's been attending today, or any of the other three, please do email us if you want to with comments. It's a really interesting discussion. All of our guest speakers, I think, found it a very rewarding experience, and we're curious to hear afterthoughts and comments. So we'd very much like to keep this discourse ongoing. And I will just, finish my comments with actually a quote from Michelle, who, as Mark actually did mention at the beginning, I read her editorial and, in a way sparked this whole series. And the quote I'll read is, Michelle, you wrote, "To decolonize, we will have to press harder on all institutions and practices that perpetuate the work of inequality and injustice. That includes universities, professional associations, their memberships and their journals, all of which embody all the wonder of scholarly inquiry, even as they also perpetuate structures of racism, misogyny, ableism, and cis heteronormativity." So I think that quote has stayed with me. I've got it on my desktop, and I think it's a great, direction for us all to work towards in the future on these kinds of projects. So I'd just like to thank you all for attending. Thank you, Michelle, again for a fantastic research and presentation, and to Mark for being a great collaborator, and for Dina for helping us and supporting us with all this, these quite a long 4 webinars now. And just to tell everyone that the final video with Michelle's talk will be online soon. And I think we've posted the link earlier in chat. So please do watch the other ones.
Thank you so much, Ronnie, and all for your fabulous questions. I saved the chat.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.